Well, if I could hit the redo button on my life, I would come back as one of Frank's students, for sure. I'm going to jump right in. So my goal was to talk about something universally inspiring about this bay that we love. So being a weatherman, I decided to talk about the wind. But that's not a picture of the wind, is it? I got sick of looking for pictures of wind because all the pictures of wind shows the destruction that wind does. If you think about it, you don't actually see the wind. So I gave up and I decided to put a picture of a tidewater goby up there because I love these fish. And I also found for some reason, every time I look into his eye, I feel at peace and like it clears my mind. Is it doing it for you? So of course, if anybody's tried to get a permit through on the coast or the bay, they may not feel the same emotion when they think of this fish. So I hope to talk about wind and get to a place where I can answer this question, like, will our wind remain like it is in a changing environment and climate change? If you live here, you know it's windy here. And if you're a bicyclist, you probably hate the wind because you have to wait for it to go away or you have to suffer through it. If you're a sailor, you like the wind, although you wish it was warmer because the wind in the summer here is pretty chilly. Ironically, the only time we get a warm wind around here is in the winter. But it's not just that it's windy here. What I really want to focus on is that it's windier here. But just to be clear, I'm not referencing the winter time. In the winter, as you go north along the coast, it gets windier because you have stronger and more frequent storms. So in the winter, it's a bit different. But in the summer, or for about half the year, it's a lot windier here than it is anywhere else on the West Coast. So as you go north from this region, you find that it's less windy. And as you go south from here, you find that it's less windy overall during this time of the year. And by this region, let me just be clear, really technically I'm speaking of the part of the coast from about Big Sur to Cape Blanco or so. But from the perspective of myself and my staff that looks at wind model data a lot, and I've been doing it for 26 years, the really special part of that region is Cape Mendocino to Cape Blanco. And even to compress it further, Humboldt Bay. Like, we are the epicenter of wind. Now, I could show you some data at this point, but how fun would that be? You're going to see a lot of data for the rest of the conference, the symposium. So instead, I'm going to give you some anecdotes and then describe the mechanisms that give us all that wind. First anecdote. If you've ever bought tuna here in Woodley Island, for example, and asked the fishermen, where did you get that tuna? They're probably going to tell you they caught it off the coast of Oregon. Now, there is tuna off our coast right in front of the bay, but it's often, and if you ask them this, they'll tell you, too windy and therefore too rough to go out and catch the tuna right in front of this bay. So it turns out the business model of our tuna fleet is to leave home for a few months out of the year and go fish out of the coast of Oregon, Newport being one of the major ports. And in fact, if you get to buy tuna here, typically it's because, and you'll notice maybe it's towards the end of the season, they've been away from their family in Newport for months, and their last trip, they go offshore, they catch the tuna, and they freeze it, and they come down to this area so they can sell it to their community. And that's why you get to buy tuna here. There are exceptions. There are some years where folks can go out and catch tuna just out in front here, but by and large, they go north. The second anecdote, raise your hand if you've been on the bay and noticed the Coast Guard cutter Barracuda anchored in the bay for multiple days on end. Raise your hands, yeah. And maybe you've wondered what they're doing. They're logging sea time in the bay. Now, yeah, that's what the leadership in Alameda thought. In fact, the leadership in Alameda said, wait a minute, you're telling us you can't go out in the ocean out of Humboldt Bay, but we have Coast Guard cutters just like your Barracuda that go out of Newport, Oregon and the coast of Washington. All the boats up there seem to go out in the summertime and they're fine. So what's going on? So the Master Chief and the Surface Ops Chief came to me years ago and said, hey, can you help us explain what's going on here? And so I did. I wrote a white paper that's given them sort of authority to get sea time anchored in Humboldt Bay instead of going out into our incredibly harsh ocean. And some of that content is what I'm going to share with you right now. From a wind standpoint, we are truly special. So these are two meteorological features, synoptic scale features. So the thermal low, that's essentially down there in southern part of the state, the nation, and the Pacific high or the subtropical high that sits out over the ocean. And as you can see from that red arrow, we kind of lie in the pathway between those two features. In fact, there's a region that is really sort of typically on the path. And yes, it varies. Sometimes that low moves offshore. Sometimes the highs in different places are different strengths. But this is just a typical, pattern for almost half the year that we have set up here on the West Coast. As you go farther south down the coast, you get farther and farther away from the high, and so the influence of the Pacific high diminishes. You're still influenced by the low, but you need both of those because wind flows from high pressure to low pressure. I may have forgot to mention that, but it's a really important part. Yeah, so you probably know that. But as you go farther south, you get too far away from the Pacific high, so that mechanism starts to diminish, and the wind is, on average, throughout that time of the year is lighter. And as you go farther north, well, the Pacific high is still really strong, but you're getting farther and farther away from that thermal low, and so the mechanism becomes weaker, and there's less overall wind on a typical seasonal basis. So yeah, we're on that pathway right here. Now, of course, the wind doesn't actually look like that because of Coriolis, which is the way things in the northern hemisphere turn to the right whenever they move due to the Earth spinning underneath them. And so if you've never heard of that before, just Google Coriolis and or YouTube, and you'll find some great animations that will make sense to you. So everything up here turns to the right as it travels, water and air. So instead of looking like that, the wind actually looks like that. And that, my friends, is our world famous northwesterly winds that we get for a good part of the year around here. And just the sheer amount, volume, reliability of the wind we get has a few great things that we get to benefit from. Our dunes are rebuilt every year by these northwesterly winds, and I'm sure you're all very happy to hear that because of what's been in the news lately of our beaches being eroded profoundly this year. We're just now transitioning into this weather pattern, so we're having northwest winds all next week, and so you should see the beaches rebuild very quickly as that wind takes the sand from the wave slope and throws it up onto the dunes and rebuilds the dunes and the beaches. So that's one benefit we get from our strong winds. It'll also keep doing that as the sea level rise. So to some extent, we should be thankful for the wind to help us keep our dunes built and as a hedge against sea level rise for the bay. That wind is almost always onshore for us. It varies. Some years the low moves offshore, we get offshore winds and we get smoke. But I'll tell you what, on average, this area is truly a refuge from wildfire smoke because of these onshore winds that we get during that season. Anywhere else you go on the coast, there's much more incidence of wildfire smoke impacting people's quality of life. So it's a tremendous benefit there. And then, of course, if you're interested in offshore wind energy, now you know why folks show up here every time. Of course, there's more to the story. That wind traveling along the water drags the water with it and sets up a current. And that current turns to the right a bit for that same reason, Coriolis. Now, this is a complex concept called Ekman's transport. Most of you know about it. But for those of you who don't, YouTube it, Google it, find an animation. It's actually really cool, and it's pretty intuitive if you see it in that format. But the net result is that as the wind blows from north to south along our coast, it takes the surface water and pushes it offshore. So that red arrow is still our northwest wind, and the blue arrow represents the offshore movement of the surface current at the coast. Again, many of you know this, but just to get us all on the same page. Another view of that, so now the wind is going into the screen that you're looking at, and it causes that red arrow that goes off to the right. That's the water that's at the surface, warmed by the sun, being pushed offshore by our northwesterly winds. And then, of course, it leaves sort of a void, which pulls deep, cool, nutrient-rich water from the ocean bottom up to the surface near the coast. Ekman's transport is an important part of our region. And of course, some of that cold, nutrient-rich water is pulled into the bay. And from that, you could say we derive a lot of incredible things as a region. Wildlife, oyster, aquaculture in the bay, and the harvesting of fish, both in the bay and outside the bay, forever. So huge impact on who we are as a region. But there's more. It's also why we have fog, right? So that warm, moist air that comes off the ocean, I describe it as warmer. It's not actually warm. It's pretty cold, right? But it's warmer than the air that it's going to become when it travels over that little band of really cold water near the coast, that cold water in the red box. So as the maritime air mass moves towards the coast, it travels over that area of cold water, and that cools the air mass, which condensates out the moisture and produces fog or high stratus that we're so famous for. So that's one of the main mechanisms of why we have so much fog in this region. And of course, that's why we have redwoods. I'm not a redwood specialist, but I understand they need it to reproduce, to keep the seedlings moist in the summertime when there's no rain. And redwoods, of course, they define who we are as a region. They have impacted our tourism and our quality of life. and they've been an economic driver, historically in the Bay for generations. So really important part of the Bay. No coincidence. I've taken and put that high and the low on a map that shows the what's the word I'm looking for? Where something exists. The range. Thank you. This is the first time this is a brand new talk, by the way. So normally a keynote address is something you've given 25 times. I just put this together just for you all. So I apologize for any roughness around the edges. So that's the Redwood Range. You'll notice it's right in that region I'm talking about. And you'll also notice it abruptly shuts off just over the Oregon border in an area that's famously known as the Banana Belt, the part of the Oregon coast that gets a lot less fog than us. So there you have it. Now that cool moist air that we get to benefit from, is a big driver and why we've earned a reputation as a climate refuge. It's why real estate prices have gone up, some say. I wish I had sat in on this talk from Mike because I hadn't done so before I put this together. I don't know if Mike's in the audience, but I hope I'm not contradicting you because he posed this question in a talk he gave a couple of years ago. So yeah, it's a really important part of what makes this a great place to live. So of course the question that comes up, and the main point of what I want to address is our wind going to remain as climate changes? And you may ask that question because you care about wind energy, depending on who you are, or the redwoods, or the marine ecosystem of the bay and the adjacent waters. Or frankly, on a more subjective level, you're curious because this is a big part of why we might be a great place to live as the climate changes around us. So to answer that question, we have to look at these two really important meteorological features. Start with the thermal low. Thermal low is actually short for thermally induced trough of low pressure. Basically, the sun heats up the land down there, which causes the air to rise, which you could, in your mind, it's pretty intuitive. It kind of creates a vacuum, and so it pulls in air from around it. So that's what creates the low pressure down there. I don't think you can find a climate scientist who would suggest that the Southwest is going to cool off in climate change scenarios. So that's probably going to stay there if anything gets stronger. It might move around. It might be different, transient behavior in time. But that one is a pretty sure thing. The subtropical high, or our Pacific high, is a little more complicated. So just to examine the mechanism that creates that. Interestingly, it's the result of a thermal low somewhere else. So right along the equator, the sun bakes that part of the earth and causes the same thing, air to rise, creating a thermal low. But that air, as it goes up, it hits a ceiling. It's called the tropopause. And it's essentially like an inversion on steroids, so things can't go past it. And then it fans out. So imagine if you're burning popcorn on your stovetop and the smoke goes up and hits the ceiling in your kitchen, it radiates in all directions. That's what essentially happens to that incredibly warm air that's generated at the equator. So it moves north, as you can see by the blue arrows by the word Hadley cell. As it moves north, it cools off and eventually it descends. And where it descends is what creates the high pressure. And that happens all around the globe. And some of them earn names like the Pacific High. That's one of those. And so the reason why I'm sharing this with you is the mechanisms that create our Pacific High that is also so important to us are some pretty profoundly fundamental aspects of how our atmosphere works. Now, you can find climate scientists who say this behavior may change to some extent, but you're not seeing them line it up saying the Pacific High is going to go away or it's going to move somewhere else, like it's going to move to Europe. It's not going to happen probably that dramatically. So a little more uncertainty, but some confidence that our Pacific High is going to remain an important part of our life. So there's a lot to worry about in this world, honestly. You're going to hear some of those worries in some of the talks given, but I would say there's some reason for hope that these mechanisms are going to stay in place to some extent. And so our northwesterly winds will stay, the upwelling will stay, and bring its benefits. Now, winter, for the record, is a different story, especially when it comes to the Pacific High. You may remember the resilient ridge that blocks storms from impacting our coast, so that's a different story. I don't have time to talk about that one, but so our upwelling looks like something we can have a little bit of confidence in. I actually found one researcher, this was really interesting. This is not related to wind, but it plays into those same mechanisms. So this is sea surface anomalies, meaning essentially where it's red, it means the ocean's warmer than where it's orange and yellow and lighter colors. And you'll see that the water state is in this scenario, which is similar to sort of the projections of under climate change, stays cooler right around our coast than it does to the north and the south. Now, water is just like air. That red blob you see up there north of us, up in the off the Pacific Northwest, because it's warmer, it actually expands and it's taller. And so it wants to flow to the south into the area where the water is cooler and therefore lower, kind of like high pressure and low pressure with the atmosphere. As it does that, the water movement is going to be from north to south, and it's going to turn to the right, and if anything, enhance the upwelling that we're getting from our northwesterly winds. So another interesting reason for for optimism. Unfortunately, south of the bay, it's the other story. Because the water is moving north along the coast, it's going to turn to the right. It will actually oppose the upwelling effect and tend to bring warm water from the surface into the coast and all those consequences. So I put a smiley face next to the big question. It's a reserved smiley face, you may notice, right? He's not out of control smiling. But I put a circle on the second part because I want to add one more thing about the bay that's so special. It kind of addresses this question about, do we get to keep living here? As well as do all the creatures get to keep living here? And it's the magic of the 40 degrees latitude. So that line there on the top of the chart is 40 degrees north, and you can see the bay is pretty much right at 40 degrees north. And there's something really cool about that. Everywhere on the Earth, the sun is constantly providing solar radiation, and then the Earth is radiating some of that heat back into space. And you can experience that if you're out on a hot sunny day and you tip up, you'll feel the solar radiation on your skin. And if you're walking on a big black, asphalt parking lot in Sacramento, you might feel the heat radiating off of it. You really can't feel it here. It's still happening, but it's pretty hard to feel it. But you've probably felt it in somewhere like Redding. It's always going on everywhere. I've simplified it here with no atmosphere to complicate things. So what's special about 40 degrees north is that it's the inflection point. So south of 40 degrees north, there's actually more energy coming in from the sun than the Earth can radiate out. So there's a surplus of energy. As you go north from 40 degrees, it's the opposite. The Earth doesn't get enough solar radiation to make up for all that this radiate out into space. So there's an imbalance. And the reason why we get to live in places like Seattle and San Diego is because the ocean and the atmosphere moves heat around and keeps those places habitable. And, if there's one of those worries that keeps you up at night, it might be a news story that you read about a conveyor belt shutting down and the consequences on climate in a given region. And that's, we're less vulnerable to that because we don't rely on it as much. In fact, if you Google, where should I move to minimize the impacts of climate change on my family, you'll see a lot of references to places that all lie between 35 and 45 degrees. So, and we happen to be right in the middle. Just a little reason for additional optimism, maybe. Maybe I'm just really feeling optimistic today, but we're a little less dependent on those conveyor belts. Now, one of those mechanisms, I'm just going to leave you with one little cool thing to think about next time you experience a storm here in this bay. One of those mechanisms is the jet stream, which is basically a collision between that warm air to the south and the cold air to the north. That forms the jet stream. And if there's a little wiggle or wrinkle in that jet stream, that's what gives us fronts and the storms that you're so familiar with. You've been looking at these little lines with the half circles and the triangles probably for as long as you can remember. That area of red arrows moving to the north, that's that warm air pushing to the north. The cool thing is we get to really experience that more profoundly here than most places, because for the wind to get to us from the south, it has to go over and then descend down the north side of the King Range. And whenever you take air and you lower it, it heats up. So when we have that warm air moving to the north, it's really enhanced and you can really notice it here. And that is actually, by the way, the best sailing we ever have on the bay is when this is going on right here. So next time you experience that, fortunately we're out of this winter, probably have to wait a little while, but think to yourself, wow, that's really cool. That's that warm air going from the south, heading north to keep those poor people in Seattle from freezing. And then right after that happens, the front moves, the storminess, we get the cold north winds. That's the cold air moving south, and you can think to yourself, oh man, how nice. That's the cold air going down to keep those poor people in San Diego from roasting. So maybe you'll experience a storm differently the next time you have one. So, I noticed that all the artwork involves, nature and recreation. I think it's a reflection, and I love the artwork. It's a reflection of our love of this bay. I would say all the work that Frank has done in reference and all the work that's being talked about in the rest of this symposium is an additional reflection of the love we have for the bay. And here's the thing about love. Sorry. looking at Frank as I say this, and it's really hard, but you worry about things you love. So I know we're all worried about the Bay. And I don't mean to be overly optimistic, but I want to give a few reasons perhaps to hold on to hope, that this bay is special in its location and how the atmosphere is going to treat it in the future going forward. There's lots of reasons to be concerned, climate change globally, and even for this region. As I said, you'll hear about some of those in the rest of the symposium, but there's some good news out there. And I'll end, because this inspired me, with my own recreation photos from the bay. And I too am including a photo of my son. On the left, that's my son. His pal Theo Loya. They've got a bait trawl, waders, and headlamps. And they're just finding what they can see. And we're out there at night because, of course, all the creatures come to the water's edge at nighttime when most of the predators are gone. And we got a bonfire to warm them after they come out of the water. Now, we've evolved that to a mask and snorkel, a wetsuit, and a underwater flashlight. We just drift over the eelgrass. So now we don't even have to touch them. We can just look at them. And it's really cool. It's really fun. And we just do that until our toes and fingers are wrinkled. Thank you.